1348 was the worst year in history because at one moment, London woke up like any other day, and by nightfall, the ships were carrying death at Billingsgate. Here's how the Black Death hits London, and subscribe because this ride is going to be epic.
Early morning.
The docks were already packed by sunrise. Ships were unloading cargo while workers were hauling wood bales on the wagon. Italian merchants were arguing with English dock workers over price, and it was just like a regular day. Neither side fully understood each other's language, but they understood money, and that's what it was all about at that point. A laborer would make 2 or 3 pence a day. That was enough to buy bread, cheap ale, and a shared bed in a crowded tenement. It wasn't enough to save anything, but it was enough to grab breakfast from a street vendor, rough bread and watered-down beer for half a penny. Thieves also worked the crowd, looking for distracted targets. The guild officials walked through, checking for illegal training. If someone is caught selling without a license, they will pay a fine or spend time in the stocks. A ship from Calais just docked at the far end. One of the sailors was telling everyone who would listen about the situation in France, where people were getting sick in the morning and dead by the evening. Black spots were coming on the skin, entire streets were gone, and bodies were piling again and again, faster than anyone could bury them. However, no one was listening to them fully. Most of the dock workers ignored him, thinking that he was just bluffing. Sailors would always come back with wild stories because they see a lot of things in their lives. On the other hand, plague happens and happens in other places, but not in London. London had already survived worse. The city was too important and too established to be wiped out by some disease that was across the channel. The market on the cheap side was always busy, and everyone was trying to head inland. Mid-morning. Then came the cheap side, which is the main commercial street from back in the days. There are wooden stalls and upper floors of the buildings hanging out over the streets so far that people on the opposite side could practically shake hands from their windows. Nobody could read hair, so shops used painted signs. A boot would be for the shoemaker, a loaf for the baker, and a piece of meat for the butcher. A baker's wife would be fighting with grain sellers about prices, and everyone's hair cost more because of the war. Bear harvests won't help them at all, and they would end up paying anyway because customers will pay more. That's how it works. A whole chicken costs around a penny, but salted fish would be cheaper near the middle of the street. Constables were dragging the thief through the crowd because they were stealing bread the day before. This would be the average mid-morning if we went to London. Punishments used to also happen in public, and it was supposed to be done so that they could set examples for everyone. The city wanted everyone to see what happens when you break the rules. Fire buckets were hanging on every corner because London burned before. In these timber buildings with thatched roofs, fire could go up fast. A town crier finally pushed through the ringing bell and shouted about new taxes to pay for the war in France. People complained, but nobody writes. Not today anyway, because everyone is just too nonchalant. A servant was carrying a full basket, walking past, heading towards the nicer part of the town, which is St. Paul's Cathedral. The plague came. The first cases of the black that showed up in late September, and some even argue that it was early October, started with a dock worker at the Queen's Dock. He started feeling sick. There were fever, chills, and a headache. Nothing unusual because people were getting sick all the time in London. He kept working because missing the day would mean no pay, and if he didn't get paid, then it meant there would be no money and nowhere to even sleep properly. By the second day, the swelling started appearing, and his groin first, and then under his arms, were lumps that started growing, the size of an egg. They were hard and painful. His wife called the barber surgeon, who lanced him, draining pus and blood. The theory is that you let the bad tumors out, but it doesn't help. The man's fingers started turning black. They weren't bruised, but actually black like charred wood. He died within 3 or 5 days of the symptom. The wife then gets sick 4 days later with the same pattern: fever, swelling, black extremities, and then death. The 2 children also died within a week. The neighbors started getting it, then the people who lived on the street, then the people who brought bread from them, from the same baker. By mid-October, dozens of cases started appearing daily. The city authorities tried to keep quiet because they didn't want to panic, but instead, panic started growing everywhere. Slowly, the train, they don't, and they didn't even want the trade to stop, but you can't hide mass death in the city of 50,000 people who were living on top of each other. The swellings were called buboes, and they started. They first appeared in the groin, armpit, neck, and everywhere, with the lymph nodes clustering. When physicians glanced at them, the smell was unbearable, like rotten meat mixed with something sweet and just wrong. Some baboos burst on their own, leaking a thick black fluid. Patients started screaming when the doctors touched them. Not everyone got these lumps, because some people just started coughing blood. Thick, dark red, sometimes almost black. They died faster. usually within 2 days. The virus spreads differently. You breathe it from someone coughing nearby, and it moves through the household in days, and then through buildings in a week. Average day in London. Before we reveal the average day in London after the Black Death hit, please subscribe to the channel because it's about to get crazy. By November, bodies were starting to pile up faster than anyone could even handle. Parish churches had small graveyards, but they were designed for normal death rates, a few burials a week. Now they were getting 10, 20, 30 bodies a day. Gravediggers were working around the dog. They dug mass graves, trenches, and stacked bodies in layers, with a thin covering of dirt between them. The smell was everywhere, and no one could escape it. They were rotting corpses, untreated sewage, because there aren't enough healthy people to clean the streets. Smoke started appearing from fires burning contaminated clothes and bedding. People even tied herbs and flowers around their necks to try to filter the air, but that was useless. Entire families were dying within days, and a house would go quiet, and eventually neighbors would force open the doors to find everyone dead inside. Sometimes bodies were sitting there for a week, where rats and flies would get them first. Nobody would want to touch plague corpses, because there was a belief that you could catch it from the dead, which turned out to be partially true. However, the flies and corpses were still infectious. The city started hiring plague carts, which were workers, usually criminals, offered pardon or desperate poor people who were willing to risk it for high pay. They went street by street shouting, "Bring out your dead!" Families would drag bodies to the curb. The cart workers would use hooks and poles to load them without touching them. They were supposed to take them to designated plague pits outside the wall, but sometimes they would just dump them in the River Thames, which caused another problem. Shops were closed, markets were thin, and bakers kept working because people needed bread. But half of their workers were dead or already fled the place. Prices have spiked through the roof. A loaf that cost small in summer costs 3 pence now, which was more than the wage most people were earning. People were writing over food. Constables were trying to keep the order, but there weren't any healthy constables left. Physicians were running. Priests were of no use, and anyone with money and place went outside London. They set up roadblocks and turned people away at the spear point. The refugee camps in the field were spreading plague faster than anything else. Then came December. Worst days. An average day in London in December was a little too different. Church bells used to ring for every death. The passing bell, they called it. By mid-November, they stopped because the passing bells would never stop ringing. Everyone would be just coming there. The constant tolling was driving the survivors insane. Now, curfew was rigidly enforced, and nobody on the streets was found after dark except the watch and play card workers. But the worst part were looters. Houses were full of dead people, but they would still have valuables inside. Thieves would often break in, strip the bodies, and steal whatever they could. If they were caught, they were hanged immediately without any trial, because justice was swift at this point. Families barricaded themselves inside the home, and if someone gets sick, they try to hide it because the city has started making plague houses. A red cross was painted on the door, sometimes with "Lord have mercy on us" written underneath, because people at that time were quite religious. Once the house was marked, nobody would come near it. You can't get food delivered. You can't get a physician, even if one is sick. Still inside the city, you are just sealed in, sick, dying, hoping to recover. Some people survived the plague. About 30 to 40% of people who got the baboonic form live through it if the baboons burst and drain on their own. Nobody knows why some survive and others don't. The pneumonia form, the ones that attack the lungs, was almost always brutal. Maybe 1 in 10 would survive and were usually crippled afterward, because their lungs were permanently damaged. Survivors were changed. Some went mad, genuinely insane from the trauma and survivor's guilt, while some became hyper-religious, convinced that God spared them for a purpose. On the other hand, some abandoned all morality, fearing that they are about to die, so why not just steal, drink, and sin while they could? Most authorities were horrified by how quickly the social order collapsed. A day in life in London was quite interesting, because now a father didn't care about the son or the wife, and vice versa. The families were breaking, and people were terrified of their own families. St. Bartholomew's Hospital was overwhelmed. The monks kept working even as half of their bodies died. They were bringing in 50 patients a day in a facility that was meant for 20. Beds were shoved together. Multiple people shared their single beds. The monks couldn't even keep up basic care. Patients were lying in their own sorrow. Some people came with the plague and caught something else on top of it. The monastery graveyard also filled up within weeks, and then they dug new pits in the field outside the city. Then came January, which was the worst. London was freezing. Food supplies were particularly low. The Thames also froze partially, with bodies being visible on the ice. Guilds started collapsing, law and order barely existed, and religious processions happened constantly. Some people thought that it was spread by bad air, while some thought that it was punishment by God. Nobody understood it, or realized that it was the fleas on rats that were spreading bacteria. They can see that being near sick people is dangerous. By February, the death rate finally started to slow, not because anyone did anything, but because the most vulnerable population was already dead. The average day in February would be that the city survived and is now fundamentally different. Half of London's population was 1,000 dead in 6 months. Entire streets were empty and businesses were shattered. This is what the Black Death looked like in London. It wasn't poetic, not distanced, just brutal. Let us know what you think about it in the comments down below. And if you like the video, please subscribe to the channel for more.